Hello, class. Now let's wrap up our discussion of psychodynamic approaches to personality by looking at what is bad about those theories and what is good about those theories. And man, we can say a lot about the bad aspects of these theories, but is there anything that we could salvage from these theories? Anything that could provide useful in our discussion of personality or be useful to psychology in general? All right, so first thing, let's go into the criticisms. The first criticism is the most damning, and this is something that I want to make sure that you know and that you remember. These theorists are not basing any of their theories off of scientific data. They're not conducting experiments, they're not conducting research studies. They are just kind of intuiting what they think personality development is like. They're intuiting what are the major struggles of humanity. They're basing it off of their own childhood, as we have seen time and time again. They're basing it off of their clinical experience, but not really based off of any research. These theorists really didn't conduct experiments or anything like that. They just treated patients, and based off their experience with patients, they came up with their theories, which is not a very good way, not a very sound way of creating theories in psychology. So if the data doesn't support your theories, which in many of the instances that is the case, especially with many of the different premises of the theories, then it's kind of useless for science. All right, so very damning criticism there. That doesn't mean that some of the aspects of these theories are wrong. It just means that in positing them and proposing them, the theorist had no idea that that scientific research would back them up. All right, and we'll talk about some examples of that here shortly. Another criticism is that the clinical populations that these theorists were working with are not representative of all human beings. So Freud worked primarily with middle-aged Austrian women, Viennese women, and those were his clients for the most part. Now, for the most part, middle-aged Viennese women with mental disorders are not very representative of all human beings. So the struggles that those women were going through are not representative to the struggles that everybody goes through. Also notice that Freud's theory, he states that the critical period of development in personality occurs in the first few years of life. How many children did Freud study? Not a single one. All right, he's not really focused on children, even though the early years of someone's life is very critical to Freud's theory of personality development. All right, here's Freud's famous couch. What are some other criticisms that we might levy against this? Overemphasis on childhood events. All right. Personality still continues to develop outside of childhood, not just the first 6 years of life, but there's definitely an overemphasis on the events in early childhood. Another thing is there's an overemphasis on one's parents, the influences of one parent, specifically one's mother. All right. According to a lot of these theories, the dad doesn't play as much of a role. We know that this is a false conclusion. Also, we talk a lot about early experiences in the family, but not early experiences with friends. And we know from developmental psychology that your relationships with your friends are as important, if not more important, to who you develop to be as a person compared to what your parents do. So friendships are awfully important, but they're not talked about here in these psychodynamic theories. There is an overemphasis on the role of nurture and not really nature in what the variability in personality. So why do you develop to be a good person or a bad person or an extroverted person or an introverted person? According to these psychodynamic theorists, it's completely due to how your parents raised you, the events that you encountered early on in life, when in actuality, genetics makes up a huge proportion of this variance and why people might differ on personality. So nature is very neglected in these theories. It's all about your experiences early on in life. Nurture reigns supreme. All right, and these theories are overly simplistic, at least in terms of human motivation. Humans are motivated for a wide variety of reasons, not just a singular drive like sex or power or safety. Humans have a lot of needs that they need to take care of. They're motivated by many things. So it is overly simplistic to try to boil down all of human behavior as being a result of a singular drive. All right. These theories are very grand in scope. They're trying to explain all of human behavior. And in that framework, it's very admirable that they're trying to explain all of this. But you really can't do that. Humans are very, very complicated creatures. There's many reasons why we do things. And in trying to boil down our entire existence into, well, we want sex and sexual desire is going to lead everything that we do as human beings is a little bit overly simplistic. So trying to boil down everything into a singular drive is not really going to work out that well. All right, but again, the major criticism, all of these are problematic. But if you're not basing things off of scientific data, if you're not conducting research studies, if you're not going out there and actually examining the populations that you are theorizing about, this is not science, all right? Your theory is worth about as much as a can of beans. All right, so does that mean that we've wasted all of our time in this, this series of lectures? Or is there some information that is still relevant here from these psychodynamic theories? And I'm going to argue that there are four major components of psychodynamic theories, in particular Freud, that Freud got right. Now, not by conducting research studies, just by his intuition, but four things that are quite important to personality, four things that are quite important to psychology. And I'm basing these off of these wonderful papers by Weston and Kramer. And I will put those in the optional readings because they are very interesting reads. Again, you don't have to read those, but I thought it would be good for you to have copies of those papers. Okay, four things that Freud got right. Biggest one is the importance of the unconscious. Psychology, up until Freud, was very interested on what is occurring in conscious thought. Like, how do people reason through their decisions? It took Freud to explain, well, there's a lot of things that are going on below the surface of consciousness. There's many mental processes that we're not even consciously aware of. And nowadays we know that this is the truth. In fact, that there is more going on in our minds unconsciously than there is consciously. And so nowadays we study the unconscious in a ways very different than Freud. We don't study it via dream analysis or Freudian slips. We've developed some very interesting ways to get at unconscious processes. So that's the biggest thing that Freud got right. Two, many mental processes occur in parallel. What do I mean here? For Freud, remember, there's the id, the ego, and the superego. And sometimes these different parts of our mind are in conflict with one another. Sometimes the id wants immediate gratification, and sometimes the superego says we should not do that. And the ego has to find some middle ground between the two of them. So different parts of our mind are arguing with one another, and there's some competition. These mental processes are occurring at the same time. That's what I mean when I say that they're occurring in parallel. The notion of mental conflict, or different parts of the brain processing things differently at the same time, is something that we know to be true nowadays. Now, there's not the id, the ego, and the superego, but when we perceive things, we are perceiving and processing different aspects of some stimulus in different parts of our brain at the same time. We'll talk about some examples of this here in a second. All right. Childhood experience. All the psychodynamic theorists, for the most part, argue that early childhood experiences are very important for the development of personality. We know that this is the case. It isn't the sole determinant of personality, but early childhood events are important for who we develop as people. So they are right about that. Again, this is not the only determinant, but it does have some lasting implications on our personality. Some of the defense mechanisms that Freud proposed, ways to protect us from anxiety, do actually exist. Now, they operate in a different way than how Freud believed that they did. For Freud, there's some information that's too uncomfortable in the unconscious, so we have ways of preventing it from reaching consciousness for us to feel bad about ourselves. So we kind of keep it boiled down into the unconscious. Some of the defense mechanisms we actually do, but it's more, we use them more in a way to protect our self-esteem. We want to feel good about ourselves. So we have some ways of tricking ourselves to keep a high image of ourselves, to keep our high self-esteem. And we'll see some examples of those. All right, so let's jump in to what we mean by studying the unconscious nowadays. All right, so where do we see the unconscious appear in modern psychology and scientific psychology today? So we see it occur all the time in cognitive psychology, but typically it goes by another name. So unconscious, that word, has a very Freudian ring to it. And for those of us in research psychology, we don't like it having a Freudian ring to it. So we've come up with another set of words to describe the unconscious and conscious mind. Whenever a cognitive psychologist calls some process explicit, they mean that it's occurring consciously, that we are consciously aware of that mental process, compared to an implicit cognitive process. If we talk about implicit memory, or if we talk about any cognitive process being implicit, essentially we mean unconscious. And again, we've switched the terminology because Freudian words have a really negative connotation to them. They have an unscientific connotation to them, and we want to get rid of that. So we refer to things as explicit, being conscious, or implicit, being unconscious. Some great examples of this in cognitive psychology, perhaps the study of attention. One of the earliest attention tasks out there is the dichotic listening task. In the dichotic listening task, what we do is we have people put on some headphones and we play two different messages to them, one on the right ear, one on the left ear. And we have the participant shadow or repeat the message from one of the channels, either the right or the left ear. All right, so here we have this fellow who's hearing in his left ear, President Lincoln often read by the light of the fire, and he's repeating this, and there's something that's going on in his right ear, the ignored channel. What early attention researchers were interested in is how much of this information is in the unintended channel is the participant processing. And as it turns out, you can ask people, what did you hear in the unintended channel? And they say, I remember nothing of that. I don't think I've processed a word of that. In fact, you can repeat the same word 70 times in the unintended channel, and they have no idea what that word is. All right. The only thing that they can tell in that channel, for instance, if there's noise, if there's not noise, if the speaker's voice goes from male to a female voice, they're able to tell, maybe changes in volume, but any meaning in that unintended channel that they're not paying attention to, they do not remember, they do not process, or it seems like they don't process. But as it turns out, people are processing some of this information. So perhaps if we play that person's name, so they're going about the attended channel, President Lincoln often read by the light of the fire, and then in the unintended channel it says Tyler, Tyler, Tyler. All of a sudden, I'm going to switch my attention over to the unintended channel. So it seems that the individuals are processing some of that information in the unintended channel, but they're processing it unconsciously, implicitly. And only when it is important does it enter consciousness, such as someone's name. You might have had a similar experience. This is known in cognitive psychology as the cocktail party phenomenon, where you're at a party or some event and there's multiple conversations all over the place. Then all of a sudden, someone says your name way across the room, on your ears perk up, and you weren't paying attention to the conversation over there, but now you are because someone has said your name. All right, your name is very salient. It elicits attention towards whatever is saying your name. All right, so maybe some information is being processed implicitly. Another good example of this is with a mirror tracing task and specifically procedural memory. When we refer to something as an implicit memory, this is unconscious memory. All right, unconscious memory. Procedural memory, or how to perform a task like riding a bicycle, shooting a baseball, what am I talking about? Shooting a basketball, all these skills are examples of procedural memory. For individuals that are really good at shooting a basketball, it's hard for them to explain what exactly they do. They just do it. A good example of this comes from some research on HM. Okay, HM, a famous patient in the history of psychology. HM, his real name is Henry Molaison, and many years ago, HM had problems with epilepsy. His epilepsy was really, really bad as a child. And the doctors, who didn't know that much about the brain at the time, knew at least that if they were to remove the epicenter in the brain of these seizures, these epileptic seizures, that HM would stop having these seizures and he could go about living a normal life. So HM agrees to this, HM's parents agree to this, and so they decide to remove on both sides of HM's brain, his hippocampi and his medial temporal lobes. All right, on both sides of the brain. Those were the epicenters of his epileptic seizure. So they do the surgery, and the surgery is a success in that HM no longer has any epileptic seizures. But if you remember the story, HM also has a disability at this point in time that they didn't realize what happened. HM can no longer form any new long-term memories. All right, HM cannot form any new long-term memories. He remembers his childhood perfectly fine, but every day he wakes up and doesn't really realize where he is or why he's there. All right, so does that mean that HM can form absolutely no long-term memories? Well, he can't form any new conscious memories or explicit memories that he can remember, but they decided to test this out by having HM do this mirror tracing task. So what you do for this mirror tracing task, you have to put your hand between a metal sheet that you can't see through, and there's a mirror on the other side so that you have to draw while looking at the mirror. And the task is difficult because if you direct your hand left, it goes right in the mirror. All right, it's a little bit of an illusion, so it takes some practice. So they tell HM about the mirror tracing task on day one, and he starts the mirror tracing task. And, he's making a lot of errors. He's going pretty slow on it. Okay, that's day one. So day two, they say, okay, HM, they sit him down with the mirror tracing task. Do you remember any of this? And HM says, no, I have no idea what you're doing. So they have to explain the task to him again. And then he does it. And lo and behold, he's a little bit better at the task. They do this day in, day out across a couple of weeks. And he gets much better at this task, even though he does not consciously remember ever doing this task. So procedural memory is getting better. Unconscious memory, HM is having some kind of unconscious memory, right? Skill memory, procedural memory. So the unconscious is something that's very important in the study of psychology. Some other examples of implicit memory, classical conditioning. So for instance, anytime I see this color blue, that of the Lay's potato chip bag for salt and vinegar, I immediately start to salivate. If I even think about Lay's potato chips, salt and vinegar, I start to salivate. This is something that occurs unconsciously. All right. Sometimes I'll see this blue and I don't even know why I'm salivating, but I start to salivate. Okay. So there's many types of memory that are occurring unconsciously. All right. So there's multiple types of implicit memory here. All right. So for instance, if we have somebody, another type of implicit memory is priming. If I give you these certain words and ask you to fill in GR blank, 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 you're going to fill it in with green, even though you might not consciously remember seeing these colors earlier on in the experiment. Whereas if I were to do the same thing over here and tell you to just fill in the missing word, you might write, in this case, grape, even if you consciously don't remember the fact that you were presented with fruits beforehand. You don't know why you fill in green in this situation and grape in that situation, but it's the context. Okay, a lot of things are occurring mentally in the unconscious. But cognitive processes are not the only example of this. There are also emotional processes that are occurring in the unconscious. What we can do is we can hook somebody up to measure skin conductance, look at their galvanic skin response, and do something similar to the dichotic listening task that we talked about earlier. But this time, what we do before the dichotic listening task, we present people with city names. So Chicago, San Francisco. And for some of those city names, we give them an electrical shock. So we're sending an electrical shock whenever they hear certain city names. Now we get them to do the dichotic listening task. We have them shadow some message. And in the unintended channel, we present city names. All right, some to the words that they were shocked by, others to cities that they were not shocked by. After the experiment's over, we ask them, do they remember hearing any city names in the unintended channel? They say no. But we look at the galvanic skin response and we see a heightened galvanic skin response for the cities that they were previously shocked towards. So it does seem like their brain is processing what's occurring in this unintended channel, all right, the message that's going into the ear that they're not paying attention to, because it's leading to an elevated galvanic skin response. But they're not consciously processing this information. This is a study by Courtine and Wood in 1972, if you're interested. Another example of how we might process some emotional stimuli. So if you have to go get a dental procedure done, all right, sometimes there is multiple options for anesthesia in these cases. So maybe they might give you the nitrous oxide or the clown nose type thing, or they might give you a more powerful sedative. Okay, so actually put you under. And in both situations, consciously, you do not feel any pain. All right, you don't feel any pain in both of those situations. But afterwards, let's say that we play the high-pitched squeal noise of a dentist drill. If you have the nitrous oxide, even though consciously you didn't experience any pain, if I play the high-pitched drill noise, you start to wince. All right, you're still being classically conditioned in that situation. You're processing the pain unconsciously, and it's leading to an association between the high-pitched drill noise and the pain that you experienced. However, if we actually put you to sleep, have some anesthesia like that, we play the high-pitched drill noise, you don't have the same reaction. So even though you might not be feeling any pain consciously, your body's still processing that pain unconsciously. Another great avenue of research is in the field of implicit attitudes. All right, implicit attitudes. Even though consciously we might think that we like something, maybe unconsciously we have certain opinions of that thing. We either dislike it, we are afraid of it. Even though consciously we know maybe this is not something that we're supposed to be afraid of or something that we're supposed to like, maybe unconsciously we have a different opinion of it. And there's a very interesting way of assessing implicit attitudes. All right. So the task that I'm going to show you is called the implicit attitudes test. This is a test developed by Tony Greenwald and colleagues. And what they do is they have you perform a task, and you're going to use both of your hands. You're either going to press the left button or you're going to press the right button. And you're going to see some words. Okay, if it is a word that is good, it means something nice, like ecstasy or friendship or wonderful. You're going to press one of those keys. And if it's a word that's bad, like hateful or evil or something along those lines, you press the other key. But not only are you going to see words, you're going to see some other type of stimulus as well. So in the most famous instance of the implicit associations task, these are faces. So faces of either white individuals or black individuals. And in the first part of the task, we might associate, or we might have for the left key, this is good words and white faces. And on the right key, we have bad words and black faces. So you do that task trying to do it as quickly and accurately as possible, and either faces or words pop up on the screen. In the next half of the task, they switch things up. Now you're going to press the left key for black faces and good words, and the right key for white faces and bad words. And we see how quickly and accurately you perform that. And then we can compare those two conditions. If in your mind, good words pair equally to black faces and white faces, you're going to be equally quick in both conditions. But let's say that you have some implicit bias towards white faces. All right, you view white people not consciously but unconsciously as better than black faces. Okay, better, you associate them with more positive things. Well, if that's the case, you're going to make that association quicker. And so in the condition where the white faces and good words are paired together, you're going to do a much better job at that task if you have an implicit bias towards white faces. All right. If you have an implicit bias towards black faces, and you associate black faces more readily with positive words like perfection and wonderful, you're going to be quicker at the version of the task where you press the same key for black faces and good words, and white faces and bad words. So based off of your reaction time and the difference between your reaction time in both tests, we can get a measure of your implicit bias towards particular races. And we can do the same thing with women. We can do the same thing with gay versus straight individuals. We can do the same thing to measure if you are more of a dog person or a cat person. So difference in RT, what does that matter? Why should it matter? Well, it ends up being a good predictor of certain things. So in this study by Fazio and colleagues in 1995, we see that we can measure both explicit racism. So explicit racism, we ask you, how do you feel about white versus black individuals? Do you think that they are equal in all of these different domains, or do you think that they're unequal in some of these domains? Like maybe you prefer white individuals compared to black individuals. Well, that, of course, is going to predict some things. But as it turns out, people are likely to lie on that test. All right, they know that it's not socially acceptable, or maybe they believe consciously that they're not a racist individual. They know from growing up that there should be no differences between white and black individuals, but they still might have a bias implicitly. And what we see is that performance on this implicit association task ends up being a better predictor of, in a hiring task, do you hire this person or compared to this person? We see that the implicit association test predicts your hiring practices. So whether or not you're more likely to employ white individuals compared to black individuals. So this has a huge impact on a lot of important behavior, such as who you end up accepting for a job, even though their background characteristics are exactly the same. The only differences happen to be the individual's race. All right, and this is a huge societal problem. It's a huge issue in which people consciously, they don't believe that they are biased in any way against a particular gender, against a particular race, and yet unconsciously, it might lead them to some decisions that are not optimal. All right, so good example of this is some white individuals might walk on the street and they see a black person, and they might cross the street sometimes without even knowing why they do that. If they have this implicit bias, perhaps they feel unsafe, they don't know why they feel unsafe, and they cross to the other side of the street without even knowing why they do this. All right, this is very, very important. All right. Another good example of this has to do with biases towards women and implicit biases towards women. In New York City, when conductors, there we go, conductors of orchestras were making decisions about who to hire, they would have a cited playing test in which they would have people would sit down, they would play their instrument, and the conductor would make a decision about this person gets to be in the orchestra or this person does not get to be in the orchestra. And what they ended up doing is they hired and accepted a lot of guys and not a lot of girls. And when there was a competition between who would get first chair in an instrument, that is the person in the orchestra that plays that instrument the best, more likely men were in those positions compared to women. So does that mean that men play musical instruments better than women do? No, not necessarily. There's no reason why that should be the case. As it turns out, because it's a cited test, because you can see who's playing the musical instruments, these conductors are more likely to accept and promote men, because they just perceived unconsciously that the men did a better job of the performance. If we were to take that cited nature away and have a blind audition, where we have these individuals play the instrument behind a wall and have the conductor make a decision, and in this case, we end up finding that this bias goes away. We see that equal amounts of men and women end up being accepted into the orchestra because of this. Okay, and this can occur not just because someone's explicitly or consciously sexist, that they consciously think that women cannot play instruments as good as men. Maybe it has to do unconsciously, because every time that they've seen an orchestra in the past, it has been filled with men. All right, maybe society projects this kind of notion. So when they're making their own decisions, they're being influenced by the way that things have previously been presented to them. So it's very important that we acknowledge that we might be implicitly biased in certain ways. So for instance, when I grade your test, well, when I grade tests that are paper, not when I grade tests online, it's a little bit more difficult. What I do is I tend to grade them backwards so I don't see the person's name when I'm grading them. The reason for this is, even though I might try to be objective, I might be implicitly biased for some students compared to others. For some students that might ask a lot of questions in class, I might think, well, they clearly know what they're talking about, so I might give them the benefit of the doubt. Whereas some students that might not say anything in class, I might look at their answer that's similar and say, nah, I don't think that they understood this, so I'm going to take away more points. All right, so we have to, as a society, try to minimize our implicit biases or minimize the effects of some of our implicit biases. All right. Another great example comes from a reading that I asked you guys to do by the guy that actually taught me personality psychology, Larry James. Larry James argued that unconscious processes are very important for studying personality, but in many instances, they're not studied objectively. They're not studied in ways that are both reliable and valid as well. So how do we get a good measure of what's occurring unconsciously? Larry James had an interesting way of doing this. He called his approach the conditional reasoning task. Now, the conditional reasoning task, the first one that he created, had to do with aggression. Now, if you were to ask somebody, are you an aggressive individual? Are you the kind of person that's likely to throw punches? And let's say that we're doing this in the context of trying to find out who to hire for a job. Everybody's going to say, no, I'm a wonderful individual and I get along with everybody. People are going to lie to you. So explicit measures of aggression are not necessarily very good at predicting who's likely to be aggressive in the workplace. So you got to have a very indirect way of assessing this aggression. Maybe the person feels justified in every single instance that they've been aggressive. So how do we get at whether or not this person is unconsciously aggressive? So Larry James argued that one way that we can do it is to give them a test that we say is not a personality test. We give them a test and say, this is a reasoning task. And we're trying to see how good you can reason. And based off of the answer choice they pick, it will tell us something about their personality. So here is an example item from Larry James's conditional reasoning test for aggression. All right. A large number of business partnerships break up. One reason for the large number of breakups is that dissolving a partnership is quick and easy. If the partners can agree on how to split the assets of the partnership fairly, then they can break up simply by filling out the appropriate forms. They do not need to engage lawyers. Which of the following is the most reasonable conclusion based on the above? And there's 4 answer choices. 2 of these answer choices don't make any sense, so people are very unlikely to select them. Okay, the younger partner is more likely to initiate the breakup. D, there's nothing about younger versus older partners in this part, so that doesn't make any sense. All right, the longer a partnership has existed, the less likely it is to break up. This one doesn't make any sense. There's nothing about longer partnerships here, so we get rid of that one. Okay, so they're either going to select B or C. B makes sense if you think that everybody is out to get you. And if you think that everybody is out to get you, you're more likely to be an aggressive person. So B is, if one's partner hires a lawyer, then he or she is not planning to play fair. All right, if somebody's getting a lawyer, they're trying to mess you up. If that's the logical thing that you get from this passage, you are implicitly thinking that other people are out to get you, that they're trying to take advantage of you. And if you select this choice, you're more likely to be an aggressive individual. All right. C, on the other hand, partners might resolve their differences if breaking up was harder and took longer. This makes logical sense if you don't have that aggressive bias. So based off of a bunch of answers to this conditional reasoning test, we can see whether or not an individual is implicitly aggressive or not. All right, and Larry James has shown in a variety of situations that this does a much better job of predicting aggression in the workplace compared to explicit measures of aggression. One of my favorite examples is that, was it in Kentucky or Tennessee? I believe Tennessee, during intramurals, so intramural sports, where a bunch of college students played some basketball against one another. Larry James had all of these intramural players take the conditional reasoning test for aggression and an explicit measure of aggression, and then looked at how they performed in these intramural basketball teams. Explicit measures of aggression predicted who was likely to throw punches and throw elbows. Okay, if you say on a scale of 1 to 7, I like to be aggressive, and you put the 7, you're the one throwing the elbows. All right, but the implicit measure of aggression, the conditional reasoning test, predicted aggression on the sly. So for intramural basketball players, if the ref made a call against them, or they were angry at the ref, what they would do is they would take that basketball and bounce it to the side so that the referee had to run and go chase to get it. That's kind of passive aggressive. So in that situation, the conditional reasoning test did a good job of predicting that. The point I want to make here is that the unconscious is still being studied today in modern psychology, but we're trying to do it a scientific way. We're trying to do it using a data-driven way, not just analyzing someone's dreams or looking at Freudian slips. But the unconscious, we know now, is very important to the study of the human mind. Many cognitive processes are occurring in the unconscious. So something that we need to be mindful of. All right. Other thing that Freud got right, many mental processes occur in parallel. They occur at the same time. So for instance, let's look at some differences in cognitive psychology. Instances of cognitive psychology where we have multiple processes occur at the same time. When we look at sensation and perception, when we're trying to perceive something, what we know is that there's two streams of processing that occur in the brain for us to perceive something. These streams are called bottom-up processing and top-down processing. Bottom-up processing, we're going from the actual stimulus that we see or hear to try to uncover what that information is. And it starts at the sense organs. And let's say it's vision, starts in our eyes, goes all the way back to our occipital lobe at the very back of our head. And that stream starts to go forward towards the temporal lobes, towards the frontal lobes. That's how that processing starts. Top-down processing, on the other hand, relies on context, okay, based off of what we're reading, based off of what we've already seen, trying to identify what it is that we see. And that stream of information goes from the frontal lobes back towards the temporal lobes. So these two streams of processing kind of meet in the middle to determine what something is. So if I were to show you this object right here, and you were reading it from left to right, what is this thing in the middle here? Well, you're going to say a 13, but why do you say it's a 13? Well, bottom-up processing, you see that there's one line, and there's this curved line right here, all right? But it's kind of ambiguous what this thing is. But top-down processing, we see a number, we see another number. This is probably a number. So based off of the context given by top-down processing and what these shapes actually are, bottom-up processing, we determine that this is a 13. Whereas if we were reading up and down vertically, A, C, this is probably a B. Okay, the context has changed, top-down processing has changed, bottom-up is still the same, and we perceive this object as differently. So two streams of mental processing are occurring at the same time whenever we perceive something. All right. Anytime we hear something, anytime we see something, context is important. Multiple brain areas are processing that object or whatever it is we're perceiving at the same time. Another good example of this is in visual search. So for a visual search task, you're trying to find the odd shape out, the odd thing out. So sometimes we can process the entire display in visual search in parallel. And by in parallel, we process them all at the same time. If I were to show you this and you had to find the odd one out, you're clearly able to tell that it is this one, if you're not red-green colorblind, that is. This one is green. We were able to process all of these different lines at the same time and pick which one was the odd one out. All right, your brain processes them all at the same time. However, sometimes in visual search, we have to do this serially. Serially means one at a time. So in this case, we are unable to process all of these shapes or all of these crosses at the same time. We have to do them one at a time, all right, to see which one is the odd one out. As it turns out that it's this one right here, because the green line is vertical instead of horizontal, and the red line is horizontal instead of vertical. So, like Freud argued, the id, the ego, and the superego were all processing information at the same time. Many mental processes occur at the same time in the brain. Freud is right about that. Even with certain affective or emotional or attitudes, we might hold conflicting attitudes towards something, all right? Sometimes we can both like and hate something at the same time. Let's look at the following example, all right? Let's ask people their attitudes for giving blood. Do you really like giving blood? Yay, very positive. Or do you very much dislike giving blood? All right, as it turns out that this does not do a very good job of predicting who's likely to give blood if a blood truck pulls up to campus, for instance. Who's likely to donate their blood? Attitude for giving blood in this case doesn't do a very good job of it. That's because people can be conflicted about giving blood. All right, they can maybe think giving blood is a very good thing to do, but also be very squeamish about giving blood. So let's ask this question in a different way. All right, let's break it down into someone's positive attitude for giving blood and their negative attitude for giving blood. Positive attitude here is, how much do you think society will benefit from you giving blood? How good will you feel when you're done giving blood? Will you feel like you have helped save the world, or do you see giving blood as useless? All right, on a scale of 1 to 5 here. All right, then we are going to look at your negative attitude for giving blood. How squeamish do you think, or how squeamish are you towards blood? You don't really like to be pricked. You don't like seeing your blood. You might pass out. If that's the case, you might put a 5. Maybe if you put a 1 here, you don't mind blood at all. You know, you can prick yourself all day. It doesn't bother you. You're not really squeamish. Now, notice in this situation that let's say that you really think it's societally important for you to give blood, but you're very squeamish. Beforehand, you might have said no opinion. All right? Because, yeah, you think giving blood's good, but you don't like to do that because you're very squeamish. You don't like the sight of blood. All right? How about somebody that doesn't think that it's very important to give blood, but is also not very squeamish? Again, they might have picked no opinion. But these two people are very different. All right? Your positive attitude for giving blood is a better predictor of whether or not you will actually give blood. If you think that it's societally beneficial for you to give blood and you feel good about helping society out, you're much more likely to donate blood. How squeamish you are is not a very good predictor of whether or not you're likely to give blood. All right? So we might have conflicting opinions about something. So giving blood, we might both like giving blood and think that it's important to society, and hate giving blood because we hate the sight of blood. So very much like the superego and the id might process things differently, have a different opinion towards an act. We might find the same thing when we are looking at attitudes towards something in modern psychology. Third thing Freud got right, childhood experience is important for personality. This is true. It's not as important as Freud said, but it's still important nonetheless. So, for instance, childhood trauma, if someone has been abused, if someone has experienced a certain degree of trauma as children, this we know leads to differences in personality later on in life. These individuals report being higher in neuroticism. All right, they're more likely to suffer from mood disorders and anxiety disorders later on in life. So early childhood trauma, we know, has an impact on the personality of someone later on in life. All right, we know that it is related to the amount of mental illness later on in life, whether or not someone's likely to behave in an aggressive fashion and end up in prison later on in life. All right, and the amount of drug abuse later on in life we can attribute sometimes to early childhood trauma. All right, a lot of negative consequences here of trauma early on in life. We also know that parenting style has an impact on your personality later on in life. All right, so is your parent overly strict? Is your parent very demanding? Someone's parenting style has an impact on their children and the kind of personality their children is going to have. This is research that really was started by Baumrind that you might have learned about in human growth and development. Last thing here, attachment. So attachment, similar in many ways to object relations theory. Attachment theory is something that you have probably heard about in human growth and development. If you've had that class, we know that a child's attachment to their parental figure has a huge impact on well-being later on in life. Children that are securely attached as babies end up developing into adults that have more healthy romantic relationships, more healthy friendships with other people. So we know attachment to parental figure, very important for someone's personality later on in life. All right, but there's one caveat here. It's hard to know if the relationship is straightforward, that it is parenting and that it is attachment leads to these good outcomes later on. Or if it's the case that there's a third variable. Remember, correlation does not equal causation. Perhaps it's the case that some genes cause you to be securely attached, cause your parent to behave a certain way, and those genes also cause you to have more successful relationships later on in life. We can't really tease those apart easily. There are ways to tease them apart, though. All right. Last one is that psychologists today, specifically in social psychology, study defense mechanisms. They call them by different names. They don't call them things like projection or denial. They call them something else. All right, but they still exist, and they're ways to protect self-esteem. All right, in social psychology, a big motivating force for human beings is to feel good about themselves, to feel that they're capable of something. So sometimes we play tricks on our minds, play tricks on ourselves, so that we can feel better about ourselves. All right, so we view these as ways to protect self-esteem as opposed to outlets for information that's in our id that we don't want to surface to our consciousness. So we think about these things differently than how Freud did, but they still exist here. All right, and they go by different names. Remember projection. Projection's all about, well, I don't need to think about this problem if I accuse you of having the problem. This is something similar in social psychology that's called the false consensus effect. False consensus effect is the effect in social psychology where you argue that more people agree with you than actually agree with you. All right, so let's say that you have an extreme opinion of something. You might argue that more people have your opinion than actually do. And one of the reasons for this is it helps protect your self-esteem. If you're the only person that has this fringe belief, well, then you might be wrong, right? You're on the outskirts. But if you think more people have that belief, well, you don't have to feel bad about it. Everybody believes the same thing you do. Good example of this is looking at research on the acceptance of climate change. If you were to ask the public how many scientists agree that climate change is a real thing, they might say 55%. Okay, so a little more than half of climatologists think that climate change is the thing. When in actuality, and this is an older graph, it's probably much higher nowadays, 97% of climatologists agree in climate change. So why do people downplay this? Well, if they don't think that climate change is a real thing, they might argue that more people have the similar beliefs than them, more scientists have the same beliefs as them, because then they don't have to feel bad about that opinion. All right, they don't have to think that I'm the odd one out here, that there are other people that have the same opinion that I do, whereas in actuality that is not the case. So a similarity, false consensus effect, is similar to projection in this way. It's a way to protect someone's self-esteem. Also remember reaction formation. This is where we have something that's painful in the unconscious that we are concerned about. So what we do is we react against it. All right, we react against that negative thing in the unconscious. Good example of this is, let's say back in the day that you are attracted to a member of the same sex and you feel guilty about this, so you go on a crusade against gay and lesbian individuals. All right. This is similar to something in social psychology called self-presentation ploys. So maybe if you are uncomfortable towards a particular race of people, towards a particular sex of people, maybe you might try to counteract this prejudice by behaving overtly positively towards that race or other group of people. I have, oh, well, let me give you a couple examples of this. If you've seen the movie Get Out, when the main character visits his girlfriend's family, the first thing that the father says is, I would have voted for Obama a third term. Maybe he might say that his favorite music is that of Tupac Shakur. So he's trying to act like he's not racist by behaving in an overt way in which try to counteract that racism, right? I really liked Obama. I really like rap music, okay? Going out of your way, okay? Because you're insecure about these racist feelings that you have, so you try to react against it, okay? I've been in a lot of parties where there will be one black individual that shows up to the party, and then all of a sudden, all of my white friends and family end up having a accent that is very exaggerated. Okay, why do they do this? This is a weird phenomenon. But again, they might try to counteract against their implicit racism in a way and try to behave overly nice to the one black person that shows up at the party. All right, another great example of this. A few years ago, a good friend of mine was getting married in Pennsylvania. And this was like the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, a very, very rural area. And I went up to the wedding with a good friend of mine, Yesh. And Yesh's family was originally from South Asia. So Yesh is the first individual of Indian descent that many of these people in this rural town in Pennsylvania have ever seen before. And we get to the wedding, and we're at the reception, and me and Yesh are sitting by one another, and this couple across from us, who we've never met before, decides to pick up a conversation with Yesh. And they don't know much about us, obviously, but they know Yesh is of Indian descent. So what do they talk about? What do they talk to Yesh about? Okay, the only other Indian person they have ever known is Raj from Big Bang Theory. So they start comparing Yesh to Raj and talk about things that occur in Raj's life and see if Yesh has experienced the same thing. Okay, Raj is shy around women. Is Yesh shy around women? It was very awkward. It was hilarious for me because I'm one of Yesh's good friends, and so I found this really, really funny. Not really funny for Yesh though. But why were these individuals doing this? Maybe they have this implicit racism that they're trying to react against. It's a wedding. They're trying to be very nice. So they're trying to counteract that in some way to using self-presentation to seem like they're not as racist. Okay. So some defense mechanisms actually do exist. Freud is right about them. But the reason why people use these strategies is for a different reason. It's to preserve self-esteem. Okay, very different than what Freud argued. All right, let's end our discussion there. And good luck on test 1. Thank you guys, and I will see you next week.